May 12, 1943. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, a cold gray expanse that had already swallowed thousands of men and hundreds of ships. Captain Heinrich Vogel stood in the conning tower of U-537, his fingers numb around salt-crusted binoculars, watching something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. 7 other U-boats ran on the surface around him in broad daylight, their gray hulls cutting through moderate swells at 17 knots. It was a formation that violated every principle of submarine warfare learned through 4 years of brutal combat. Every instinct Vogel had developed through countless patrols screamed that this was wrong. Suicidal, even. But the mathematics had been perfect. The planning had been meticulous. And in 15 minutes, all 8 boats would be gone. The Americans called their new aircraft Liberators. On that spring afternoon, they would live up to their name in the most devastating quarter hour of anti-submarine warfare the Kriegsmarine had ever experienced. What happened in those 15 minutes would fundamentally alter the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, doom hundreds of men, and prove that in modern warfare, courage alone could not overcome technological superiority. This is the story of Operation Seeteufel, Sea Devil, and the day that changed everything. The perfect plan. 6 weeks earlier, in the concrete bunkers of Lorient, France, the mood among senior U-boat commanders had been one of controlled desperation. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, had summoned his most experienced captains for an emergency conference. The topic was one that haunted every submariner's nightmares. Allied air power was strangling the Wolfpack tactics that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic. The numbers told a grim story. In the first quarter of 1943, U-boat losses had spiked dramatically. Aircraft were appearing in places they shouldn't be able to reach, detecting submarines with uncanny accuracy, attacking with devastating precision. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and the concrete pens that had once seemed like fortresses now felt like elaborate coffins waiting to be sealed. Captain Heinrich Vogel, commanding the 9th U-boat flotilla, had spent months analyzing patrol reports, survivor testimonies, and intelligence assessments. He was a methodical man, trained as an engineer before the war, and he approached naval warfare with the same analytical precision he had once applied to designing machine components. His presentation to the assembled commanders was built on cold, hard mathematics. According to every intelligence estimate the Kriegsmarine possessed, there existed a gap in Allied air coverage, a zone between 600 and 800 nautical miles from Newfoundland where 4-engine bombers simply could not reach. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had a documented range of 2,100 miles. Yes, but operational realities reduced that theoretical number dramatically. Fuel for the return journey, time spent on patrol, the weight of bombs and depth charges, combat operations with full combat load reduced the effective radius to approximately 600 miles from coastal bases. Vogel's plan was elegant in its simplicity. By forming a surface convoy of 8 U-boats in this mid-Atlantic gap, they could achieve sustained speeds of 17 knots, nearly triple their submerged speed of 5 to 6 knots. The formation would cross the Atlantic in 5 days rather than the 15 required for individual submerged transit. 8 boats arriving simultaneously at their patrol stations, fully fueled, with full torpedo loads, ready to unleash coordinated attacks on Allied convoys. The operational mathematics appeared flawless. The gap zone measured 400 nautical miles wide. Allied patrol aircraft would need 8 hours of flight time just to reach the zone's edge, leaving perhaps an hour of loiter time before fuel considerations forced them to turn back. An hour to search 400 miles of open ocean. The odds of detection were infinitesimal. The commanders around the table studied Vogel's charts and calculations. Some voiced concerns about the risks of surface sailing. Others pointed out that desperation demanded bold action. The wolf packs were dying slowly, picked off one by aircraft they never saw coming. Perhaps the only way to survive was to do the unexpected, to go where the enemy believed they could not be threatened. BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, the U-boat High Command, approved Operation Seeteufel on April 3, 1943. 8 Type 9C U-boats were selected for their extended range capabilities. These were the long-range boats, designed for operations far from home waters, displacing 1,120 tons surfaced, carrying 22 torpedoes, and mounting both 37mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns for surface defense. The boats selected represented some of the finest vessels in the Kriegsmarine inventory: U-537, U-541, U-543, U-546, U-548, U-552, U-558, and U-564. Their crews were experienced, their commanders capable, their equipment well-maintained. If any formation could execute this dangerous crossing, it would be these 8 boats. What German naval intelligence did not know, could not have known, was that the British had already closed the gap. The intelligence failure. In a nondescript building in Malvern, England, scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had been working around the clock on a problem that seemed insurmountable. How do you extend the range of an aircraft beyond what its fuel tanks allow? The answer came through a combination of ingenuity and ruthless calculation. Remove everything non-essential. Strip out armor plating that protected the crew. Install auxiliary fuel tanks in every available space, including the bomb bay. Optimize cruise altitude and airspeed for maximum fuel efficiency rather than combat performance. Accept higher crew risk in exchange for extended range. The modified B-24D Liberators that emerged from this program could reach 850 nautical miles from their bases in Newfoundland. They had closed the mid-Atlantic gap completely, creating a continuous umbrella of air coverage across the entire convoy routes. But the Germans didn't know this. Their intelligence estimates were based on standard B-24 specifications, not on the radical modifications the Allies had implemented. There was more. The new aircraft carried ASV Mark 30 radar operating on 10-centimeter wavelength. This was a revolution in detection technology. Earlier radar systems operated on longer wavelengths that U-boats could detect with their search receivers, giving them warning to dive before aircraft arrived. The new centimetric radar was invisible to German detection equipment. A U-boat running on the surface radiated a radar signature as clear as a lighthouse beam, completely unaware it was being tracked. And there was one more piece of the puzzle that would seal the fate of Operation Seeteufel. Signals intelligence from Bletchley Park had been tracking German preparations since mid-April. The codebreakers working on the Enigma naval codes had intercepted and decrypted messages about a major U-boat movement planned for early May. They didn't know all the details, but they knew enough. 8 boats, mid-Atlantic transit, surface formation. RAF Coastal Command and U.S. Navy Anti-Submarine Command knew the U-boats were coming. They knew approximately when and where, and they had assets positioned to intercept. The 8 U-boats sailed into a trap they didn't know existed, based on intelligence estimates that were fatally wrong, using tactics that had been rendered obsolete by technology they had no knowledge of. It was a perfect storm of intelligence failure, and it would cost 382 men their lives. The Gathering Storm. May 11, 1943, late evening. The 8 U-boats rendezvoused 150 miles southwest of Iceland, rising to the surface from the depths one by one, like great gray whales. Signal lamps blinked in the gathering darkness as commanders confirmed their positions and synchronized their watches. At first light, they would begin the dash across what they believed was the safe zone. Vogel's operational order was precise and detailed. The formation would sail in 2 columns of 4 boats each, with 500 meters spacing between vessels. They would maintain a zigzag pattern, changing course every 20 minutes to frustrate any potential torpedo attacks from Allied submarines. Continuous air watch would be maintained from all vessels, with at least 6 lookouts scanning the sky at all times. At any sign of aircraft, the formation would scatter and dive. The plan accounted for every contingency they could imagine. What it didn't account for was an enemy that could see them from beyond the horizon, that could track them with invisible radar, that could reach them in a place they believed was safe. As dawn broke on May the 12th, the 8 U-boats submerged for the dangerous twilight hour when aircraft visibility was optimal, but boats were silhouetted against the lightening sky. They remained submerged until full daylight, then surfaced at 0800 hours and began their high-speed dash eastward. The sea state was moderate, with 3 to 4 foot swells and scattered clouds at 3,000 feet. Visibility was excellent, 15 miles in clear air. The weather was perfect for their crossing. It was also perfect for hunting. 300 miles to the west, Lieutenant Commander James Harrington had been airborne from Argentia, Newfoundland, since 0530 hours. His B-24D Liberator, nicknamed Atlantic Reaper, represented the cutting edge of anti-submarine warfare. The aircraft had been stripped of every unnecessary pound of weight. The crew of 10 had been reduced to 8. Every available space contained additional fuel tanks. The bomb bay held 8 depth charges and 8 500-pound general-purpose bombs with hydrostatic fuses. Harrington was a veteran patrol commander with 18 confirmed U-boat attacks to his credit. He understood the game being played in these waters. The submarines were trying to cross the mid-Atlantic gap before air patrols could reach them. His job was to prove that gap no longer existed. The ASV Mark III radar operator, Petty Officer Second Class Robert Kellerman, sat hunched over his scope in the aircraft's dark interior, watching the green phosphorescent sweep paint returns across the screen. The radar could detect surfaced submarines at ranges up to 12 miles in optimal conditions. But the ocean was vast, and even with radar, finding submarines was like searching for needles in a haystack made of water. At 1332 hours, everything changed. Kellerman saw the returns appear on his scope almost simultaneously. 8 distinct contacts in formation, bearing 047 degrees, range 18 miles. His heart rate spiked. 8 contacts meant one thing: U-boats running in a wolf pack formation. This wasn't a random detection. This was a strategic target. Harrington received the report and immediately banked toward the contacts. His mind raced through tactical calculations. 8 U-boats meant potentially 64 anti-aircraft guns if they stayed on the surface to fight. His single aircraft would be heavily outnumbered. But surprise was on his side. And more importantly, the depth charges in his bomb bay meant he could kill submarines faster than they could kill him. He approached from the southeast, keeping the sun behind him, descending to 200 feet above the wave tops. The Liberator's 4 Pratt & Whitney engines roared at maximum cruise power, pushing the heavily loaded aircraft toward the hunting grounds at 210 knots. At 1345 hours, lookouts on U-5522, the rear boat in the western column, spotted the Liberator. The warning was transmitted immediately. Aircraft bearing 135, altitude low, closing fast. Captain Klaus Förster, commanding U-552, felt his stomach drop. This wasn't supposed to be possible. They were 600 miles from Newfoundland. No aircraft should be able to reach this far into the Atlantic. But the evidence was undeniable. A 4-engine bomber closing on their position at high speed, and they were caught on the surface with nowhere to hide. Emergency dive procedures required 30 to 35 seconds from alarm to submergence. The Liberator was 40 seconds away. The anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their weapons, but coordination was impossible. 8 separate U-boats, 8 separate crews, no unified command structure, no time to organize a coordinated defense. Vogel in U-537, at the formation's head, made the decision that would seal their fate. All boats to remain surfaced and engage with anti-aircraft fire. It was a command born of desperation and pride. German naval doctrine held that submarines should fight back when attacked, that showing courage in combat was essential to maintaining crew morale. But doctrine written in peacetime classrooms did not account for the reality of modern air attack. The decision condemned 7 boats to destruction. 15 minutes of hell, 47 hours, and 12 seconds. The Liberator's nose guns opened fire at 800 yards, and the Battle of the Mid-Atlantic began. Tracer rounds streaked toward U-537 like lines of fire drawn across the sky. Every 5th bullet was tipped with phosphorus for visibility, creating an almost hypnotic pattern as 50 caliber rounds tore through the air at 2,900 feet per second. The gun cameras mounted in the Liberator's nose recorded everything in grainy black and white film that would later be analyzed frame by frame. The first rounds reached U-537's conning tower in 1.2 seconds. Captain Heinrich Vogel, still standing with binoculars raised, never saw what killed him. 3 armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck simultaneously. 1 in the chest, 1 in the neck, 1 that removed the top of his head. 4 other crew members on the bridge died in the first 2 seconds of fire. The lookout attempting to reach the 37mm anti-aircraft gun pitched backward, his body falling into the open conning tower hatch and blocking the emergency dive procedure that might have saved the boat. 18 seconds into the attack, the bombardier released the first depth charge. The 650-pound Mark 44 fell away from the bomb bay, tumbling through 150 feet of air before striking the water 40 feet ahead of U-537's bow. The hydrostatic fuse was set for shallow detonation at 25 feet depth, optimal for catching submarines attempting to dive. The explosion was cataclysmic. 300 pounds of Torpex explosive, 50% more powerful than TNT, detonated with a force that created a massive underwater pressure wave. In the incompressible medium of seawater, that pressure wave traveled at 5,000 feet per second, striking U-537's bow with the force of a sledgehammer hitting an eggshell. The pressure hull, designed to withstand gradual compression at operational depths, could not survive the instantaneous shockwave from a close proximity explosion. Rivets sheared along the forward compartment seams. Steel plating buckled. Seawater flooded into the torpedo room at tremendous pressure, driven by the weight of the ocean itself. U-537's bow lifted completely out of the water from the force of the underwater detonation, then plunged downward at a 45-degree angle. The submarine's forward momentum, still 17 knots, drove the damaged bow deeper. Within 8 seconds, the boat was pointing almost vertically toward the ocean floor 2,400 feet below. 52 men rowed her down into darkness, most of them never understanding what had killed them. The Liberator continued its strafing run without pause. The timing could not have been worse. The stern was still near the surface, while the bow had descended to 25 feet, presenting maximum surface area to the pressure wave. The explosion crushed the after torpedo room, ruptured fuel tanks, and damaged the propeller shafts. Diesel fuel mixing with seawater created a massive slick on the surface, marking the submarine's grave even as it sank. U-541's stern rose at an impossible angle, almost vertical, as flooding forward compartments dragged the bow downward. 47 men died in the lightless interior, thrown against bulkheads and equipment as their boat became an iron coffin plunging into the abyss. Some screamed, some prayed, some simply held on to whatever they could reach and waited for the end. It came quickly, hull-crush depth at 750 feet, where the pressure hull imploded with the sound of a thunderclap that traveled for miles through the water. U-5I-43, commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Hans-Jürgen Offer, attempted to fight back. The 37mm gun crew had reached their weapon and opened fire. The anti-aircraft gun, theoretically capable of firing 80 rounds per minute, sent shells toward the Liberator in a desperate attempt to drive off the attacker. 3 rounds struck the bomber's port wing, punching holes through aluminum skin. 1 shell severed a hydraulic line, another damaged a fuel line, but none hit critical systems, and the Liberator kept coming. Return fire from the bomber's waist guns killed 4 of the 5-man gun crew instantly, their bodies tumbling into the sea. The third depth charge fell at 13:47 hours and 24 seconds. It detonated directly beneath U-543's pressure hull amidships, the most vulnerable point of the submarine's structure. The explosion lifted the entire 1,120-ton submarine clear of the water like a toy thrown by an angry child. Crew members below decks were thrown against bulkheads with bone-crushing force. Men in the engine room were scalded by ruptured steam lines. The pressure hull cracked along its length with a sound like a cannon shot that echoed through the dying submarine. U-543 broke in half. Both sections, still connected by electrical cables and piping, began to sink. The cables snapped. The pipes tore free. Both halves sank separately, taking 52 crew members down with air still in their lungs and terror frozen on their faces. Total time from explosion to final submergence, 20 seconds. 12 seconds had elapsed since the attack began. 5 U-boats remained. The Liberator still had 13 weapons aboard. The tactical timeline unfolded with mechanical precision. U-546, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Paul Dietrich, executed what would be the formation's only successful escape. Dietrich had recognized the hopelessness of surface combat the instant U-537's conning tower exploded. His crew performed the crash dive procedure flawlessly. Conning tower hatch sealed, vents opened, main ballast tanks flooded, bow planes angled to maximum down deflection. The submarine achieved 30 feet of depth when the 4th depth charge detonated 50 feet from the hull. At that depth, with water providing a cushion, the pressure hull could withstand the shock wave. The boat shuddered violently. Light bulbs shattered throughout the interior. Gauges cracked. Crew members were thrown against equipment. But the hull held. Dietrich ordered the boat to 200 feet and emergency speed. U-546 escaped into the depths, damaged but operational. 48 men owed their lives to their captain's instant decision to dive rather than fight. But survival meant abandoning 7 sister boats to their fate, a choice that would haunt every survivor for the rest of their lives. U-548, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Elreck, caught fire when the 5th depth charge detonation ruptured diesel fuel lines. Burning fuel, lighter than water, spread across the surface faster than men could swim. 23 crew members abandoned ship, leaping into water that was already beginning to burn. 18 died in the flames, their screams carrying across the water to the other doomed boats. 5 survivors, pulled from the water 3 hours later by a Canadian corvette, bore burn injuries so severe that 2 died during evacuation to Newfoundland. U-552, the boat whose lookouts had first spotted the Liberator, faced the 6th weapon. Captain Klaus Förster had kept his boat on the surface, attempting to bring multiple anti-aircraft weapons to bear. The 20mm guns rattled out hundreds of rounds. The 37mm gun fired methodically. Not a single round struck the Liberator in a vital area. The return fire from the bomber's multiple gun positions killed or wounded every man on deck. The depth charge exploded directly beneath the control room. The blast ruptured the pressure hull in multiple locations simultaneously. The submarine sank bow first at an angle approaching 60 degrees. Seawater flooded through the damaged hull at such pressure that men in forward compartments were crushed against bulkheads by the force of incoming water. The entire boat disappeared beneath the surface in 14 seconds. No survivors. 54 men gone. U-558, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Günther Krech, attempted a surface run to escape. The diesel engines were pushed to emergency power, 18 knots in a desperate sprint. The depth charge fell short, but detonated shallow. The pressure wave struck the stern at an oblique angle, jamming the rudder hard to starboard and destroying the port propeller shaft. U-558 began a death spiral, turning in tight circles at high speed, with no ability to steer or dive. Krech, recognizing his boat was doomed, ordered abandon ship. 36 men jumped into the Atlantic. The submarine continued its circular course for another 2 minutes before flooding pulled it under. 29 of the 36 survivors were later recovered by Allied ships. 7 died from hypothermia in 44-degree water before rescue arrived. 1 minute had elapsed since the Liberator opened fire. 7 U-boats were destroyed or crippled. 1 remained. The final stand, Oberleutnant zur See Reinhard Suren, commanding U-564, was the formation's youngest commander at 26 years old. He had spent 60 seconds watching submarines die and learning from their mistakes. Staying on the surface meant certain death. Diving made a submarine a stationary target. He needed a third option that doctrine did not permit and regulations did not anticipate. He would fight and dive simultaneously. At 13:47 hours and 54 seconds, as the Liberator completed its run past the burning hulk of U-558, Suren gave his orders. All hands to diving stations. Prepare to crash dive. Flak crews remain at stations and fire until water reaches the guns. Engine room. Maintain full power until I order dive. It was tactically insane. Gun crews couldn't fight while the boat was diving. The open conning tower hatch would flood the control room. But it was also U-564's only chance to survive. The 37mm and 20mm gun crews opened fire as the Liberator banked for its second attack run. The anti-aircraft fire, more accurate now after watching the aircraft's attack profile, stitched holes across the Liberator's fuselage. One 37mm shell struck the starboard waist gun position, killing Seaman First Class Daniel O'Connor instantly and wounding the port waist gunner. Another round penetrated the radio compartment, destroying communication equipment. Lieutenant Commander Harrington felt the aircraft shudder under the impacts. They had taken more damage from this one submarine than from the previous 7 combined. But U-564 represented a threat that could not be allowed to escape. If even one boat survived to report what happened here, the intelligence value alone would justify the risk. The Liberator lined up for its second run, approaching lower and faster. 150 feet altitude, 220 knots airspeed. U-564's anti-aircraft crews tracked the aircraft with increasing desperation. Suren, watching from the bridge, waited until the Liberator was at 600 yards before giving the order. Emergency dive. All guns cease fire and clear the deck. The gun crews abandoned their weapons and dove for the conning tower hatch. Suren was the last man on the bridge. He slammed the hatch shut, as water already flowed across the forward deck. U-564 began its dive with the Liberator 400 yards away and closing at 220 knots. The release point for the 8th depth charge would be in approximately 6 seconds. But the Liberator crew faced an unexpected problem. U-564 was diving while maintaining forward momentum, creating a moving target below the surface. The bombardier, Ensign David Walsh, had to calculate not where the U-boat was, but where it would be when the depth charge reached detonation depth. He had perhaps 3 seconds to solve a 3-dimensional trigonometry problem while wounded men screamed behind him and anti-aircraft fire rattled through the fuselage. Walsh released at 13:48 hours and 22 seconds. The depth charge fell free, tumbling through 150 feet of air before striking the ocean surface directly above U-564's stern. The submarine had reached 40 feet of depth. The hydrostatic fuse was set for 25 feet. The weapon descended past the pressure hull without detonating. It exploded at 25 feet depth, but 80 feet behind the submarine's stern. The pressure wave, attenuated by distance, struck the submarine with enough force to crack deck plating and blow out internal light bulbs, but not enough to rupture the pressure hull. U-564 descended to 250 feet, leveled off, and continued eastward at slow speed, escaping into the Atlantic depths that had swallowed 7 of her sister boats. At 13:48 hours and 45 seconds, the attack ended. Elapsed time, 1 minute and 33 seconds. U-boats destroyed, 7. Survivors in the water, 68. Kriegsmarine losses, 382 men dead or missing. The cold mathematics of rescue. The Liberator Atlantic Reaper turned northwest, climbing to 1,000 feet for the 8-hour flight back to Argentia. Harrington's fuel gauges showed 900 gallons remaining, enough for the return flight with minimal reserve. The crew treated their wounded and counted their damage. 23 holes in the fuselage, 1 man dead, 2 wounded, starboard waist gun destroyed, radio communications inoperative. For this price, they had destroyed 7 U-boats and scattered 68 German submariners into the North Atlantic. By any tactical measure, it was an overwhelming victory. But Harrington felt no sense of triumph as he watched the coordinates fade behind them. He had just killed hundreds of men, most of whom never had a chance to fight back. Below, the survivors of Operation Seeteufel struggled in 44-degree water. Kapitän Lieutenant Friedrich Elrech, blown overboard from U-548, clung to a wooden ammunition crate with 3 other men. His watch, still functioning despite immersion in seawater, showed 13:55 hours. The attack that destroyed his world had lasted less than 2 minutes. He watched the Liberator disappear into the northwestern sky, and knew rescue would not come from that direction. The water temperature of 44 degrees Fahrenheit gave unprotected swimmers approximately 90 minutes before hypothermia induced unconsciousness. After that, death followed quickly, body temperature dropping, heart rate slowing, consciousness fading into a cold darkness that mimicked the ocean depths claiming their submarines. Some men prayed, some cursed, some simply floated in their life vests and waited. The oil slicks from ruptured fuel tanks stretched for miles, creating rainbow patterns on the gray Atlantic swells. Debris fields marked where submarines had gone down. Wooden planking, cork life preservers, personal effects that would never be returned to grieving families. And bodies, some still moving weakly, most already still. The Canadian corvette HMCS Drumheller, operating as part of Escort Group C2, received the coded transmission at 14:42 hours. The message, forwarded through naval intelligence channels, provided precise coordinates and described multiple U-boat sinkings with survivors in the water. Commander Anthony Griffin immediately altered course to maximum speed, 16 knots, toward a position 180 miles northeast of his patrol station. The corvette arrived at the coordinates at 18:20 hours, 4.5 hours after the attack. Sunlight slanted low across the Atlantic, illuminating a scene that would haunt Griffin's dreams for the rest of his life. The debris fields stretched for miles. Oil slicks created dark patterns on the water, and floating among the wreckage were men, some waving weakly, some motionless, all in various stages of hypothermia. Griffin's crew worked with desperate efficiency. Scrambling nets were deployed over the side. Sailors climbed down into the cold water to reach men too weak to climb. Lifelines were thrown to swimmers still conscious enough to grasp them. One by one, the survivors were hauled aboard. Some conscious, some unconscious, some clearly already dead, but still kept afloat by their life preservers. Of the 68 German submariners who entered the water, Drumheller's crew recovered 42. 31 were pulled aboard alive. 11 were dead from hypothermia, their bodies cold and stiff, eyes open and staring at nothing. 26 bodies were never recovered, lost to the Atlantic depths that had claimed their submarines. The transformation from enemies to humans requiring aid occurred with remarkable speed. Canadian sailors who hours earlier would have gladly killed these men now worked desperately to save them. Hot coffee, blankets, warm clothing stripped from their own backs, medical attention for burns, hypothermia, and injuries. The universal recognition of suffering transcended nationality and ideology. Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Elreck, senior surviving officer present, formally surrendered to Commander Griffin at 19:45 hours. The traditional ceremony could not occur. Elreck had lost everything but his life vest in the water. Instead, he gave his name, rank, and serial number, acknowledged his status as prisoner of war, and requested that the names of the dead be recorded. Griffin granted the request. The list, written in Elreck's shaking hand on Drumheller's official stationery, preserved the names of 382 Kriegsmarine submariners who died on May 12, 1943. That list would later be delivered to the International Red Cross, which would notify families throughout Germany that their sons, husbands, and fathers would not be coming home. The strategic aftermath, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz received the report of Operation Seeteufel's destruction on May 14, 1943, at BDU headquarters in Berlin. He read the decoded message 3 times, unable to fully process what it meant. 7 boats lost in a single action. 382 men dead. 1 boat escaped. 1 boat survived by pure luck and tactical brilliance. The loss of 7 U-boats represented more than just tactical defeat. It was a strategic catastrophe that revealed how completely German intelligence had failed to track Allied technological development. If aircraft could reach the mid-Atlantic gap, if radar could detect surfaced submarines beyond visual range, if the Allies could concentrate forces based on signals intelligence, then the entire foundation of Wolfpack tactics had collapsed. BDU operational orders issued May 16, 1943, marked a fundamental shift in U-boat doctrine. All formation sailing in daylight hours was prohibited. Submarines were ordered to transit individually, fully submerged during daylight, surfacing only for battery charging in darkness. The aggressive Wolfpack tactics that had nearly severed Britain's Atlantic lifeline were abandoned in favor of defensive evasion. The hunters had become the hunted. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point, and 15 minutes over the mid-Atlantic had accelerated Germany's defeat at sea by months, perhaps years. The mathematics were brutal. Losing 7 boats in 15 minutes was unsustainable. At that rate, the entire U-boat fleet would be destroyed in a matter of weeks. But the true cost went beyond numbers. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. If even the mid-Atlantic gap wasn't safe, then nowhere was safe. Every surface transit became a gamble with death. Every diving alarm might be the last. The confidence and aggression that had characterized early war U-boat operations evaporated, replaced by caution and fear. Intelligence officers interrogating the survivors extracted information that filled critical gaps in Allied understanding of German submarine operations. The prisoners, exhausted and traumatized, provided details about operational procedures, technological capabilities, and strategic intentions that would guide Allied anti-submarine warfare for the remainder of the war. But perhaps most importantly, the interrogations revealed how completely German intelligence had failed. The prisoners genuinely believed they had been safe in the mid-Atlantic gap. They had no knowledge of very long-range Liberator modifications. They didn't know about ASV Mark III radar. They had not anticipated coordinated air patrols guided by signals intelligence. The 15-minute destruction of 7 U-boats resulted not from tactical errors by individual commanders, but from systemic intelligence failure at the highest levels of German naval command. The Long Shadow. The 31 German survivors spent the remainder of the war in Canadian and American prisoner-of-war camps. Under Geneva Convention protocols, they could not be required to perform military labor, but many volunteered for agricultural work on Canadian farms facing labor shortages. The transition from combat to captivity, from enemy to laborer, created cognitive dissonance that many struggled to process. Post-war testimony from these survivors revealed that witnessing Canadian and American treatment of prisoners, humane, respectful, within international law, fundamentally altered their understanding of the enemies they had fought. The propaganda they had been fed about Allied brutality collided with the reality of fair treatment and basic human dignity. Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Elreck returned to Germany in 1947. He joined the Merchant Marine, eventually commanding cargo vessels on the same Atlantic routes where he had once hunted convoys. In 1963, he attended the christening of HMCS Marguerite, successor to HMCS Drumheller, as an honored guest. His speech at the ceremony, preserved in Canadian Naval Archives, acknowledged that Commander Griffin and his crew showed us the honor that warriors can extend to defeated enemies, saving our lives, and treating us with dignity when we had no right to expect anything but the depths that claimed our comrades. Lieutenant Commander James Harrington received the Navy Cross for the action on May 12, 1943. He flew 37 more combat missions before rotating stateside in November 1943. He survived the war, married, raised 3 children, and worked as a commercial airline pilot. He died in 1987 at age 72, having never spoken publicly about the 15 minutes that killed 382 men. His children would later say he carried the weight of those deaths until his final day. The sole surviving U-boat from Operation Seeteufel, U-546, continued operations until April 24, 1945, when it was sunk by destroyer escort USS Flaherty in the final weeks of the European War. Korvettenkapitän Paul Dietrich died with his boat, taking with him the memories of the day he survived by diving while 7 sister boats died fighting. Of the crew that escaped on May 12, 1943, only 16 lived to see Germany's surrender. They carried survivors' guilt that psychiatrists would later document in post-war studies of U-boat veterans. Why did they survive when 382 others died? What made their lives worth more than their comrades' lives? The questions had no answers, only the cold mathematics of chance and tactical decisions made in seconds. The eternal depths today, the coordinates 47 degrees 23 minutes north, 19 degrees 41 minutes west, mark no memorial. The Atlantic reveals nothing of what occurred there on a spring afternoon in 1943. 7 U-boats rest on the ocean floor, 2,400 feet down in darkness and cold and pressure that would crush a human body instantly. The submarines are iron tombs holding 351 men who remain at their posts decades after the war ended. Eternal submariners in steel coffins, their duty watches never ending, their families long since gone to join them in death. The ocean keeps its secrets, and the bones of these men will rest there until the steel itself corrodes away into rust and returns to the earth that forged it. The mathematics of war reduce them to statistics. 7 boats destroyed, 382 casualties, 15 minutes of combat, tactical victory for the Allies, strategic turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. But each number represented a man who kissed his family goodbye, boarded a submarine believing his captain's calculations were correct, and learned too late that technology had rendered courage irrelevant. War transforms humans into components of industrial systems where individual bravery matters less than technological superiority. The 15 minutes over the North Atlantic proved this truth with brutal clarity. The brave men who died in U-boats that afternoon lost not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they fought with tools inferior to their enemies' tools. Their sacrifice bought Germany nothing but delay. Their deaths demonstrated that in industrial warfare, victory belongs not to the brave, but to those with better machines, better intelligence, and better logistics to support them. The last surviving participant, a German machinist's mate pulled from the water by Drumheller, died in 2003 at age 81. With him died the final first-hand memory of 15 minutes that changed submarine warfare forever. What remains are documents carefully preserved in archives, photographs of young men who never grew old, and the ocean that holds 7 submarines and 351 dead submariners. The Atlantic remembers. The men who died there became part of its eternal story, their names carved not in stone but in water, their graves unmarked except by coordinates on classified maps. They fought bravely with the tools they were given. They died quickly when those tools proved insufficient, and they rest now in the cold depths, witnesses to the moment when technology overwhelmed courage and industrial capacity crushed tactical innovation. That is their memorial. That is their legacy. And that is why their story must be remembered, not to glorify war, but to understand its true nature, that in modern conflict, the brave die just as easily as the cowardly, and victory belongs to those who can build the better machine, not necessarily to those who can summon the greater courage.